Welcome to the live stream, everyone. Welcome to a productive conversation. I'm really excited to have this conversation today. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I've been wanting to geek out about one of my passions that I haven't had a chance to really dive into too much. Although I have used this passion of mine metaphorically in my work. I'll probably link to this in the show notes for those that are listening to the audio version. But also, for those of you that are watching live on YouTube right now, I wrote a piece about Titan time and how Titan time is it's not really the full 2 minutes or whatever it was. I know it's varied over the years, and you're like, what are you talking about, Mike, right now? What's Titan time? Go read the piece. It's quite interesting. It just shows that time is a construct, and story kind of illustrates how much time flows, how much it doesn't. And using that construct can create tension in story. It can create tension in a whole bunch of different ways. And of course, as a guy who talks about, the idea of managing your relationship with time and productivity, it makes a lot of sense. There's so much that I want to get into today because we're going to get to dive into the world of professional wrestling and so much more. My guest today is George Barrios. Sometimes Wrong But Never in Doubt is the book, How a Cuban Kid from Queens Transformed WWE. As soon as I got the chance to have this conversation, I literally jumped at the chance. I would say I springboarded to the chance. I would say perhaps even I did a run-in to get the chance to have this conversation today. So without further ado, we'll bring in George to have this conversation with me. George, welcome to a productive conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Hey, Mike, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. And there's nothing more than I love than talking to another wrestling fan. So this is fun. Everybody thinks if you're in Canada, hockey is the national sport. It probably is, but wrestling's a close second.
Oh, it is. Because, I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, which is like a wrestling. In fact, real quick sidebar. In Hamilton, there's a suburb called Waterdown. And Waterdown, I worked at a fast food restaurant called Harvey's. And if you've been to Ontario, Canada, the Harvey's is a well-known fast food chain. And there was a regular customer that would come into the Harvey's that I knew, and very few people knew unless you were a pro wrestling fan. And it was Jack Tunney. Jack Tunney would come into the Harvey's and I would kind of just give him, for those that don't know who Jack Tunney was, he was a wrestling promoter who was then the president of WWF at the time. Although if you've been paying attention to wrestling over the years, he was just a president on camera. He was not actually the president. But yeah, I remember he would come in and we'd order, and I would just give him a knowing glance. He knew that I knew who he was, but some of the people that weren't fans. So yes, Canada is a wrestling hotbed. I'm on the West Coast now. But yeah, there's a plethora of Canadian wrestlers that are wrestling all over the world. But the reason I want to have this conversation is I loved the title. As a matter of fact, I actually have my coffee mug that I'm drinking out of today. It says Ignore Negativity. And when you go through this book, first off, it essentially, as you put out of the gate, it's like a novel, right? It reads a lot like a novel. And so the title of the book, just to give people a sense, it comes from a performance review, right? Like, sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. You thought you were about to get fired, but that didn't happen. Can you go into that a little bit? And also Yeah, but what does it actually mean in your mind to be never in doubt without tipping into arrogance? Right? Because that's the other thing too, especially when you're talking, like, we're going to go a little bit into the wrestling. If a wrestler said that, sometimes wrong, but never in doubt, you'd be like, is that guy a heel, a bad guy, or a face, a good guy? Like, there's that arrogance, right? So what does it mean to you? Tell a bit about that story of how you make sure it doesn't tip into that arrogance area.
Yeah, I have two comments in performance reviews, and obviously, given now my age and the time I spent in corporate America, I've had a lot of them, but two of them. One was, he goes, George is a great leader. People will follow him into a burning building. The problem is he's always going into burning buildings. The second one was the one that you mentioned, sometimes wrong, never in doubt. I remember reading the review. I got it the night before the review, which I always recommend that you do if you're managing people, is give them time to digest, get their thoughts around. It was a great review, actually. I ended up getting promoted the next day. But in there was that line. He said, George is sometimes wrong, never in doubt. And I read it. I'm like, shit. He's telling me that, I'm arrogant and cocky, all true. Life has beaten that out of me over time, but at 28 or however old I was at the time, I was. And so I was nervous about that. We get into the meeting. He's giving me a review, but he says to me, so, as we're talking, any questions? And I go, yeah, Bob, why that? What's the purpose? Because it was a little bit vague. And he goes, well, what do you think it is? And I said, I think you're telling me that I got to tone down kind of the energy. And he goes, no, it's not that. He goes, I probably should have been more explicit. He goes, it comes from another book that a Harvard surgeon had written. And in it, he says that great surgeons are sometimes wrong, but never in doubt, because surgery is so difficult that if you have any doubt, you will have no success. However, to get that confidence to never be in doubt it's the preparation, the work. So what Bob was telling me is he goes, the reason you have that confidence is because of the work you do. Now, I had learned that which is why the book starts, growing up. I'd learned that from my mom, from my dad. I had learned it in my first job. Bob was telling me, now I was a little bit further along. I think I was around 30. And he's saying, hey, keep doing what you're doing. Work your ass off. Know exactly where you want to go. And then take it with confidence. Because if not, people won't follow you. And by the way, if you don't have that confidence, if you haven't gotten to the point where you have that confidence, then when you start hitting obstacles, you'll stop. So that's what I tell people all the time. It's not about arrogance. Bravado doesn't get you anywhere. Hard work that gives you the confidence to go after something means that because if it's a hard, right? If you're doing hard things, it's not a straight line up. It's a lot of difficulty. It's things that will look like failure, but are just data points where you're learning and so you can pivot. But to keep going, right? When your reputation is at risk, maybe your job is at risk, you need the confidence. So for me, that's where that comes from. And, it's, and I tell people that all the time. I go, confidence is a powerful thing, but you got to work hard to deserve that confidence. False bravado is shit, people see through it and it doesn't get you anywhere.
So we're going to circle to those lessons that you talk about at the end of the book, but this is actually a really nice segue into the world of pro wrestling because, again, that false bravado is often what you see in heelish behavior, right? Like they can't back up with it. I mean, the for lack of a better term, one of the favorite heels out there is the chicken shit heel, right? The one that talks a good game, but then backs away. How did this mentality, this approach serve you? Because number one, you said ups and downs. You had multiple tenures in WWE, which you go through in the book. How did this serve you in a world that number one is obviously it's show business and business show, right? It's both, but also it doesn't really have seasons per se. It's ongoing. Unlike other
there is no off season.
There's no off season, and so a lot of performers are literally they know that if they take some time off, there's a chance they could lose their spot. So there's cadence involved and all that stuff. How did you measure that? How did you balance that for yourself? This idea of pacing, because I think that's really important, especially in that industry.
Yeah, look, when I'd interview people to come join WWE, and they'd ask about it, what's it like? I'd say, here's one of the things that successful people at WWE share. Is they're not all wrestling fans, by the way.
No.
It's not. There are a lot, but that wasn't it, right? It's not wrestling fans. It's people who were passionate about what they did. Didn't matter if you were producing the content, marketing the content, you were in the finance team. That didn't matter. The people really succeeded. I used to say, treated their profession like a craft. They loved it. They wanted to do it. It wasn't something that they did 9 to 5. They were always doing it. And that's right for some people. It's not right for everyone. I always said, for better or worse, I don't have a lot of hobbies. I kind of stumbled in, and I told the journey, but I stumbled into something that I just ended up loving doing. It's not just WWE, it's just business, problem solving. That's what I love. So in any event, but at WWE, there was definitely this culture. All successful organizations, I think, share that element of it. But to your point, and it is tied to the cadence of what we actually did. There was no off season, and I remember asking Vince about that, right? Because there's so many similarities between wrestling and other sports. Why isn't there an off season? It's logical. And he said to me, he goes, because I was afraid if we stopped for 1 second, the fans wouldn't come back when we restarted, right?
Yeah.
So that's where that came from. That feeling like I cannot stop and lose people's attention because I may not get it back. I remember years after working together, Vince is an interesting guy. I think everybody sees the guy on TV and thinks it's this, inside it's a loud person. No, Vince, if anything, the most difficult thing about working with Vince is that he's so introverted, and and I'm not, and it's difficult to really get a feel for what he's thinking, right? So he's a quiet guy, doesn't share a lot about what he's feeling, incredibly thoughtful, but not what you'd expect. But I remember the vulnerability that, after we were working together for a few years, it would pop up from time to time. Not always, but it would pop up. And one of the times it was when we were talking about scaling, which is the technical term when you're putting on an event, of the pricing for WrestleMania, right? You'd sit, we'd be looking at a lot of information, typical business meeting around that. But the reason, it was difficult for him was because he said, when he started, he went bankrupt twice, I think, right? Putting on that event, said, I'm always afraid the people aren't going to come. And I'm like, Vince, we're going to get 100,000 people at AT&T Stadium. He goes, I know, George. He goes, but trust me, the night before, that's what I'm afraid. But that ethos drove throughout the company, and in both of those, the not an off day and never taking the success for granted and almost treating it like you had to, earn the success every day. I think it's one of the magical things about WWE.
You talk about your first zip code. I think that this is an interesting, because you touched on it earlier, and you talked about, I think we're alluding to biases here a little bit too, like the biases of Vince saying, this is where I came from. I'm so afraid, you can't lose that. It's deeply entrenched. When you're talking about looking back at where you came from, how did the biases that came from your first zip code, how have they helped you through your journey? And then maybe also where have they, caused some friction for you?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll start with the latter first, and look, and sometimes it's hard to, disentangle the first zip code, mine 11354, Queens, New York, from your own temperament. And some of these, sometimes they amplify each other. But look, I was in my first fight when I was, I think, 6 years old, when my dad took me by the hand and there were some kids saying shit outside our apartment window. And he's like, what is that? He goes, there's 4 of them. He took me by the hand. He said, yeah, we're not doing this. And made me fight each of those 4 kids, right, to get the result. And I remember telling somebody, we were talking there, well, how many fights have you been into? I was like, I don't know, 15 or 20 probably. And they're like, what? That's insane. I'm like, well, hey, look, that's the neighborhood I grew up in. Now, some of it is probably temperament. So when you say to me the 2 things, I grew up with a huge chip on my shoulder. And that has some negative outcomes, which means that, I'm a disagreeable person. And I am more than happy to not physically confront, but intellectually confront if I think you're wrong, right? And sometimes maybe to a degree, and over time you kind of meld that down. But the other thing is, and I say it in the book, one of my favorite quotes is, chips on shoulders equals chips in pockets. Whether you like it or not, people who have a chip on their shoulder are out to prove something. And so back to your question, I think some of that's temperament, some of it's the zip code, feeling like, hey, you don't deserve to be in the room. And well, so, for my whole career and still today, I'm going to prove to you I deserve, not by being good, but by kicking ass. So I think part of that is 11354.
One of the things that I found fascinating was you've got the diagram in here of the emotional journey of creating anything great. So yeah. the emotional component, we don't touch on this enough, I think, when we're talking about being productive. We talk about checking off boxes. We talk about the logical thing to do, and even maybe, which I think is a better place to go, the reasoned thing to do, which, and we'll get into the WWE network and all the other stuff that came with that. But the emotional component, it almost, in some instances, and I think it can go one of 2 ways. typically, well, I mean, it's nuanced, but I'll break it down. One way is you're so emotional that the clarity evades you, and you can't make clear decisions, and you're thinking with your heart instead of your head, and you go too far in one direction. But you can't discount emotion along the way. So can you talk about this emotional journey, and not only the journey itself, because I think obviously the journey is the big part of it, but keeping the emotions in check so that they don't compromise the great thing that you're trying to make.
Yeah, Mike. And so it's one of my favorite graphics. I do presentations from quite a bit. I have that graphic in it because the second it comes up, well, usually people bring out cameras and take pictures because everybody knows what that feeling is. Yeah, you start off, you've got an idea, and you start, man, this is the greatest thing ever. And then you get going, and you're like, shit, well, this is wrong. People maybe are looking around saying, yeah, that guy doesn't know what he's doing. Then all of a sudden you find yourself, and it's called the Swamp of Despair, right? So the actual title of that graphic is The Emotional Journey of Doing Anything Great. The one that spoke to me because I saw it for the first time when I was in the Swamp of Despair. Michelle and I were in the Swamp of Despair in the transformation of WWE. We were in the middle, and it came across, I forgot how, I saw it and I said, oh my God, printed it out, put it on my wall and said, yeah, now getting through the swamp, then if you push through, and I love it, the first thing you come out of the swamp is, hey, we made it. Okay, good. Let's call it a day. But you keep going. And if you keep going, then you get to the top again, right? You started at the top, went through the bottom, and then you get to the top, and then you look back and go, this is the greatest thing I've ever done. And I am so happy I've done it. But getting through that middle part was the hardest thing we had to do in the transformation. And not only yourself, because if you're the leader, you got to get everybody else through too, right? It's back to the sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. People are looking at you to see if you have doubt, right? And when things are tough, everybody has doubt. I remember a guy who was on our team, great. He's gone on to have a great career. He was early. And I was scared we were going to lose him, right? And he wasn't the only one, but I remember talking to him, and I said, Hassan, stick with us. One day you're going to put WWE on your CV, on your resume, and it's going to be it's the reason you're going to get the next job. You won't be explaining it away. It will be the reason. And I remember years later him saying, he's now had a great career. And he looks at me and he goes, you were right. He goes, that's all everybody wants to talk. Everybody wants to know how we did what we did. But getting through that, incredibly difficult. I was lucky, because I had a partner, Michelle. I had Vince as well, but it's different. The majority shareholder is a different feel. It's not your company, right? You've been hired to run it, but it's not your company. I was lucky. I had Michelle. A lot of times these CEO things don't work. Egos get in the way, and her and I both have big egos, but going through that swamp together and clawing ourselves out the other side is what forged our relationship. So I was lucky on the journey, but yeah, getting through that, it was a great lesson for me. It was a great lesson.
I want to circle back to Michelle in a second because she's been a great tag team partner for you, and you illustrate that throughout the book, and you've been a great tag team partner for her. But I want to go into the emotional journey again, because for those as a wrestling fan myself, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share maybe a particular performer or someone that you recognize that you saw go through that journey and has come out on the other side. That's like they went through that, or that from your perspective, that said, oh, you know what, they did it and they stuck with it and look where they are now. Do you have any examples of that in mind?
Well, look, I think there is a few of them. If you look at, and I don't know him personally. I knew him as someone in there, but watching CM Punk's journey, I think that was one where you would say, boy, this guy, I loved him. I loved watching him. Not only was he a great technical wrestler, I thought he had it factor, and then you see him disappear. And, like I said, this is an old reference, but the David Caruso from NYPD Blue, right? He's going to be the big star, and plays hardball, and then all of a sudden disappears. You don't see him again, and CM disappeared, and then made a triumphant return. So you see that time to time. Sometimes it's part of the story, and sometimes it's part of real life. But it's like, as a wrestling fan, that's part of what makes it great, right? We do great storytelling.
Yeah, Cody would be another example. Cody Rhodes would be another example, right? Stepping away, like, and what about reinvention? When we're going through this, because I think that's another. You've had to do that, like on multiple, and then I mean, honestly, the triumphant return that happens for you with WWE as well with Michelle. So, in terms of reinvention. I'd love to touch on that a bit. Was there a point in your journey where, that not only obviously the sometimes wrong, but never in doubt mantra or this idea helped you with those points of reinvention, those inflection points of reinvention along the way? Because you haven't, I mean, to be clear for those that are listening, like, it's not all been WWE for George. There's a lot of other things that happen along the way. So reinvention has to play a role in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the biggest reinvention for me was I was a fuck up in high school, right? My parents gave me great genes, a lot of intellect. It should have been easy. A bunch of self-inflicted wounds, right? I didn't apply to college. I wasn't going to go to college. My mom filled out the application at the University of Connecticut. We moved to Connecticut out of Queens because she, taught at high school there, got accepted just based on SAT scores. I had almost, again, flunked out of high school. Started the first year there and almost flunked out of first year. So to me, reinvention, and the most important person in my life after my parents is my wife. I met Carol at UConn, and a bunch of friends there, and that kind of turned things around for me. And so that was the biggest reinvention, is me getting serious and not wasting, the gifts that I'd been given. But it took a while to get there. And I got to tell you, there was a probably better than 50-50 chance that it wasn't going to end that way, that it would have ended a very different way. So, again, I owe a lot to my mom. I owe a lot to Carol, great friend group. So in some ways, I sometimes feel like I don't deserve all that. And somebody said to me once, you do deserve, you wouldn't have gotten it if you didn't deserve it. And I said, yeah, that's fair enough. But
what's interesting is you look in the book, especially in the table of contents, the longest section is The Apprentice, which is what you're talking about here. There's 6 chapters dedicated to that. The Journeyman's the four chapters, and then The Master is 5. So, I mean, clearly, what do you say to people who struggle with that apprenticeship era? That part where there's that, because we live in a world where it's go, fast, now. I mean, WWE is like that to a degree from the outside looking in, right? So what do you say to the person? Yeah, what do you say to the person who's like, they listen to the Stoic advice, which, by the way, on its face sounds like, you remember, memento mori, remember you're going to die. Well, I better do all this stuff. Well, that's not really the core of the message. So what do you say to the folks out there, especially maybe the younger folks that are like, I better do all these things now, and I don't have time, I don't have patience, I've got to grab that brass ring right now.
Yeah, and and a lot of it is people want to shortcut it, and people want to, like you said, they want it now. They want the results, and I have a lot of, some of the things I enjoy doing most. I'm a trustee at the University of Connecticut. I always laugh. They put me in the Business School Hall of Fame, made me a trustee. They wouldn't allow me into the business school when I was there because the grades were too bad. I ended up getting my MBA there. But anyway, but one of the things that I enjoy most is, I'm involved a lot with the kids. My wife and I support a high school program for underprivileged kids. We endow a couple of scholarships. I spent a lot of my time with kids, and this question comes up of, well, how did you get to where you got? And and I say, well, look, looking back, it looks like this finely crafted novel. One of my great sayings, Joe Walsh, the Eagles documentary, life looks like a finely crafted. When you're going through it, it ain't. It's a lot of pivots. And ultimately you have to develop a point of view in your life. And the only way to develop a point of view is to take in a lot of experience, right? Either firsthand by what you're doing, reading, but you got to take in, and then you got to create. You have to do things. And that, that's how you build the tapestry. So people don't want to hear that. I mean, I say that all the time. Like, hey, what should I be doing now in the age of AI, right? I tell people all the time, I'll tell you what to do. And most of you aren't going to do it, right? I'll tell you what to do. Read a shit ton and write a shit ton. Write, because that's how you think, right? Somebody, I used to say this to people all the time because, Not everybody loved it. I'd make people write. I wrote a lot for myself and for others, and I'd make people write a lot for me. And I remember, and I've had this conversation a lot, when people would complain, I'm telling, this is why I'm asking you to do it. It's not for me. I'm not asking you to write the shit for me. It's for you. Because you know why? Writing is the process by which you learn that you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Everybody can pontificate. Everybody can talk. Most people. Writing is where you think, right? Yeah. And so I tell people all the time, you should be writing every day. It doesn't have to be published, but write about what you're doing, what you're thinking, what opportunities there are, about your relationship, whatever the hell you want to focus your time on. Right. So I tell people all the time, you want to read and write. That's what you should do. In the, now again, with this context of AI, where people are saying, well, now, it'll do that. I'm like, look, for the time being, having a point of view is the most important thing that you can have. And you only develop a point of view through time and effort. But again, a lot of people don't. They want the shortcut. They and I'm like, that I don't have for you. There may be one, by the way, look, there may be one, but I don't know what that is.
Well, that's for me. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I left writing about Life Hacker and life hacks, is because people were trying to find those, like they were hacking so many things that, I mean, to hack the etymology of the word hack comes from like a term that means to cut without care. Right. So it's the without care part. Now, it's almost as if I wrote a promo for you to say, right, because I'm going to ask you something. I'm sure you do. Do you journal?
I do. Yeah. I mean, it's, you said the book in a lot of ways, is 250 pages of a journal. Right. And then that's what it is. And it's both the learnings that, the foundational learnings and how they came about. And then how they got applied, right? And we talked about it WWE, but that's really what it is. And I look, and again, back to what I just said, I realized writing about myself that I didn't know what the fuck I was talking about in some cases. It forced me to think through a lot of things that I had, buried in my own head, and, connected threads and links. So in that way, it was incredibly rewarding. Although, as I say, writing is a labor of love and hate. Everyone loves having written, but nobody likes the writing, So don't do it. But so back to the point.
And you go back to read it too, I'm imagining too, because that's which is the part I think people miss, is people will write in a journal, but then that's it. Like it's a dump, but not anything that they learn from. So you obviously go back and read it as well.
All the time. Yeah, I read two things. I read what I've written. And I also have, and I've got my own system around it of highlights I've taken of books. Those are my two I revisit a lot, is both what I've written and also what I've thought, what was important to me when I read, whether it was a fiction or nonfiction book, and it sparks ideas and you connect things. But that's how you develop a point of view. It's that process, And and again, back to what we were saying before, I don't think there's a shortcut. So, and if you haven't done it before, start now. I didn't start journaling until I was, 40. So, I haven't been doing it my whole life, but it came from that, where I was like, shit, I should be writing. I'm writing all this stuff for work, right? I'm constantly doing that. I should probably be thinking about that stuff. And, and I've enjoyed it since then.
Can you share, you mentioned you have a system for doing this, because a lot of people look for that. Like, do you have like something, like how simple, like for me, actually, I'll give you a great example. I've written about this too. When I'm reading a book, like your paper book, like, so I can actually showcase this, is, the top is all dog-eared, right? And those are points. But if there's things at the bottom that are folded, that's a quote. So I know that page has a quote. And if it's digital, it's different color highlighters on my iPad or whatever. What do you do? Because I think that this will help people kind of go through this process, right? So this would be the hack, for lack of a better term.
Without a doubt. Yeah, my hack, and look, and I've only started doing it since I went digital. So I don't read a lot physical books. What I'll do, I've got a classic list of books. I've got the hard copies of those, right? Because I like opening them up, I like flipping them. But I read 20 to 25 books a year, all of it digital. And my hack is I highlight within the Kindle app or on the Kindle, and then I use this service. It's absolutely, if you're a reader, it's absolutely worth the I don't even know what the subscription is. Probably $4 or $5 a month. It's called Readwise.
I was going to say, I knew that's what you were going to say.
Yeah, I
use
love
it,
right?
Yeah.
I love it. So as you know, Readwise syncs up all your highlights and then serves you up. It's one of the options every day. 10 random highlights. fucking love it. Because there is stuff in there that, I just enjoy it. I'm like, oh yeah, but it'll come and I'll connect this thought that was important to me 5 years ago with something I'm doing now. I'm like, oh yeah. And then I'll go back and reread that part of that book to say, right, I had forgotten about that. So yeah, I mean, that's my hack on that, and love it.
Yeah, you mentioned the reading part, and I remember seeing Werner Herzog being interviewed, the filmmaker, and he says, like, that's his advice to everybody. It's just read, 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 read. And it's interesting because when we talk about being productive and this idea of living in what I call the state of productiveness, the state of being productive, is people are so the consumption can become an issue, like the consuming of things. So how do you, especially when you're putting together a project like this or running a business or like all the, especially obviously we talked about WWE's hectic schedule. How did you have a way to kind of say, here's when I consume? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, so a few things, because there's a lot buried in that question.
Sure.
One thing is, I think you've got, look, if you're in business, if we talk about that, I'm reading stuff all the time. I'm reading pitch decks. I'm reading operating, reports of what's going on. I'm reading white papers on, the market in India and what's happening that, or what's happening in the industry. So you're constantly reading, right, just of the job. What I tell people, though, is you need to block off time to read long-form kind of foundational bedrock content. And it doesn't have to be a lot. There have been times in my life where I was reading 5-10 minutes a day, but I read 5-10 minutes a day, right? If I don't have the time, I'm still reading. It's that, look, everybody talks about it. It's the compounding. 1 little percent a day is a 3,000, improvement is a 3,000% improvement at the end of the year. It's that little compounding. So I said, again, it's the same thing with me. Vince, if I ever said the word exercise, he's like, I don't exercise, I train. I'm like, all right, but I exercise, I don't train. But I do it every day, right? Yeah. Even if it's 5 minutes, I'm doing something every day. So it's the same thing on the reading.
Yeah, that's my hack. That's interesting too, because the other hack is you have a word that resonates with you more. Vince mentioned his word, which is train. So that's another fascinating thing, is that when we're thinking about this kind of stuff and how we want to relate to time, is the words matter. Like those things land, because I mean, you talk about the swamp of despair. I mean, that hits, right? And for somebody else, it might not. They may call it. Oh God, this is going to be a pun. Rock bottom. You know what I mean? But for those that are WWE fans, you smelt what I was cooking there. But I mean, so words really I mean, again, as someone who crafted essentially what would be considered we talked about like the novel aspect of things. What to you, especially as you navigate relationships and as you're navigating, whether it's in WWE, we can focus on that if you want, but elsewhere, the words that you use to others as well as the words you yourself, how powerful and important is that for you?
Yeah, look, I mean, when you're talking to people, and we're all at some point, we're on a quest, and so you need to bring people along, and you have to there's 3 ways you bring people along. There's the logic of what you're saying. There is the bona fides that you have that people go, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about because look, he's done some stuff. And then the third part is the emotion. And when you talk about words, I one of the things I talk about in the book and how I developed the muscle is on storytelling. Is management is about cutting stone. It is how much stone. How does the stone have to be shaped? How much does it cost to cut the stone? How quickly you do it? That's management. But leadership, which is different. Leadership and management are not the same thing. It's 2 different things. Leadership is people seeing the castle that they're building by cutting the stone. And you have to have that for all of us, right? Reason I did what I did wasn't just because I enjoyed doing what I was doing. Yeah, I liked the work. I liked the craft. But there's something that's saying, hey, I'm building something here that's that's greater than what exists, and you have to bring people along. The storyteller wins. You need the logic, right? But the logic is some smaller percentage. Once you have that, that's the ante. The winning is in the story, is in capturing the hearts of people where they go, I want to go on that journey with you. And I believe that journey. And that's where words are incredibly powerful. I was telling somebody the other day, it's the way I talk. One of my big flaws in life is I have very little filter. I share too much, and I tell you exactly what I'm saying. We were talking about something. I said, look, this is what we're going to do. All right. It's a business we're invested in. This is what we're going to do. We're going to plan, and we're going to plan in detail, and it's going to be painful because we're going to have plan A, B, and C. And then once that's done, then we are going to execute violently. Right, that's 1, 1, 3, 5, 4. So some people don't like the analogy. I don't really care. We are going to execute violently. And this guy looked at me and goes, yeah. He goes, yeah, that's what, I'm with you. I want to go do that, right? This guy has big dreams, right? That spoke to him. Now, it doesn't speak to everyone. I get it. So you got to tell the story depending on who you're talking to. I sense that this guy had that, and you capture him. Now, look, if you're making shit up, if you don't feel, right, what you're saying, people are going to see through that crap every day, right? So that's why I am who I am. I try to be as authentic as possible. I mean, what is, it's like somebody was saying, yeah, well, how are you authentic? I'm like, look, dude, what you're asking me is how you fake authenticity. If you're asking me that question, here's how you be authentic. Say what the fuck you're thinking. Just say it. And even if you think that the person's going to like, well, who cares then? If they don't really like who you are or don't want to, or what you're saying, they don't gravitate to, then you're in the wrong room. Then you need to get out of that room. So don't think about how being authentic. Just say what the hell you're thinking. Just be out there. So, to me, again, it's back to that. I mentioned that other performance review, that other quote I'll never forget. And the CEO of the company, when she wrote, she goes, she goes, people will follow George into a burning building. The problem is he's always going into burning buildings, which is a good lesson. That was a good lesson for me, right? I have a little bit of the Don Quixote in me and try going after the windmills, right? I want to go, when Elon talks about building colonies on Mars, I'm like, shit, man, maybe I'll just quit what I'm doing. I don't even know. I'm not an engineer, but that sounds cool. Like, that sounds cool. So I've tempered that a little bit. But, look, again, it's part of who you are. And I've stopped going into as many burning buildings. Some, but not as many as I used to.
As you were talking about this and you mentioned the execute violently, my brain went to ruthless aggression, like almost immediately.
A good analogy. Dude, wrestling way better than I do. I got to tell you, I still remember a great story. I talk about it in the book. When we launched our SVOD service, the WWE network, right? And it's a big pivot, big business pivot. Well, One of the things, right, we had all this historical content and that we were digitizing and putting out there. And I remember Vince going to me. Real quick before you say that, you had not just the content from WWE, you had content from like a whole bunch of other wrestling organizations as well. Yes. Right. And we had to do the mundane work of digitizing, tagging it so it was searchable, all that shit.
Yep.
And that takes time and effort. And Vince goes at one point, and Vince never cursed, right? I drop F-bombs like crazy. So does Michelle. Vince, and I think I heard him say an F-bomb, I don't know, a half dozen times in the office. Might have been a little bit different, training or whatever, but in the office, maybe half dozen times in 12 years. But I remember saying to me, he goes, George, how much fucking wrestling do you think people can watch? We create the service, put it out there. Now, look, it's a service geared towards our biggest fans, people like you. And all of a sudden, we're getting the data, right? For the first time ever, this is a Nielsen shit. We can actually see who's watching what for how long. And I still remember the first time we got some pie charts or looking at what's happening on the network. And I put it in front of him. He's looking at it, and I could see he's like, fuck, And I'm like, it turns out the answer to your question is a lot of fucking wrestling.
Well,
he was so pissed I was right,
Well, the other thing is that turned into something as soon as that you have those numbers and that data. So the qualitative stuff is how many people you didn't know. Quantitatively, you knew, which then turned into Peacock, the deal with them, and then ultimately now what's happening now, right? And furthermore, currently, and this is where I definitely show my knowledge, is the vault that they have on YouTube, which was that started when you were still there as CEO, the co-CEO? That is the most popular of the YouTube channels that they're watching.
Yeah, dude, the amount of shit we got for our social and digital strategy was another thing, right? Because at that point in time, the major sports are worried because it's the fragmentation of the, look, all reasonable thoughts. We had a different point of view, but the amount of shit we took, and because we're public, as opposed to most sports leagues, you know, you're getting public investors, you're putting all your information out there. We took so much shit for the social and digital strategy, and Michelle and I just kept saying, look, we are fighting a battle for time. And we are going to, if we win the battle for time, and we became maniacal, you would think everybody does it. They don't still. We became maniacal about measuring time across the ecosystem. Time, not views, not time.
Yeah, because attention lives inside of time.
That's right. Exactly. If we win the battle for time, and it seems simple, and everybody, when I tell them, they go, oh, yeah. Then when you ask them, well, how much time exactly was viewed of your sport, nobody knows. Literally nobody knows. So, but for us, it became this maniacal obsession, and it was a big part what drove it. But we had to fight. You know, you talk about the swamp of despair. You know, we had people ridiculing us, right? Saying these guys don't know what they're doing. The SVOD service, the network, dumb idea. Then it jumps to 200 million in revenue and 80 million in profits, and they're like, wow, this is brilliant. The social digital is stupid. Who cares? Then we're the largest sports property in the world on YouTube and Facebook, TikTok later, and then everybody's like, holy shit. But you talk about a swamp of despair. I still remember, man, the stock. You know, when we renewed our first renewal with NBCU in 2013-14, which was a big increase, but it wasn't what the next increase was a few years later. But the stock dropped like, I don't know, 15 or 20% overnight. It was brutal. People were writing shit. I saw one of the nicest things Vince ever did. He called me. He's not an early morning guy. I am. He called me at 6:30 in the morning, right? The stock market hasn't opened, but you're watching the overnight shit. You know, it's a bloodbath. You know, in his gravelly voice, he goes, George, he goes, we're going to be okay. And I'm like, Vince, you don't have to prop me up. He goes, no, I know, but he goes, I'm right there with you. And I'm like, yeah, it was one of the nicest calls because it was a tough day. It was a tough day for Michelle. I still remember she calls me a day or two later, some guy on, Forbes or something wrote, the board should take George and Michelle to the top of the office building and throw them off the thing. And I was like, that's a little violent. But the same guy, right? The same guy who wrote that 3 or 4 years later called it the most brilliant transformation in the public markets, right? It was second to none. And so, but you got to put up with that shit. But you talk about being in the swamp. I was drinking mud at that point.
Well, and the other thing about that is, again, speaking of attention, nobody remembers nobody remembers that story at the time when he called you, throw them off the building. They only remember the thing because recency bias, right? Which is interesting because, as you mentioned with that call that Vince made to you, it also was probably for him to make sure he felt okay based on the biases that he had even illustrated to you years before, whereas like, we can't run, we're going to lose money, Like it was almost, I would imagine, some form of reassurance for him as well to make that call.
I am sure, look, I remember, again, another great compliment. I mean, you talk about Vince, who exudes this, physical toughness. And I remember having this conversation and he goes, I'll tell you one thing. He goes, George is the toughest guy I know. And so to your point, I think, and it wasn't about physical toughness. It was this kind of willingness to push through things. And I think you're right. I think that phone call was a little bit for him. I think he wanted to hear, in my voice, was there doubt? Were we wrong? And was there doubt? And I said, and I remember telling him, and again, not bravado, I went through the math. I go, Vince, look, here's what's just happened, right? We were getting 1/10 what the leagues are getting on a time adjusted basis in terms of consumption. We just cut it into, now we're getting 1/5. So we cut it in half. I go, we're continuing. The next one, we're either cut it in half again or better, which we did. We closed the gap significantly, and that's when everybody said, hey, they won. But yeah, I think he was probably, wanting to see if I still had the confidence in it, and I did. But again, that confidence, it came from one thing. And I said, Michelle and I, one of the great moments, it was 2018-19, so we had now arrived. And her and I are in the back of a car. We're doing what we always doing, right? We're on the road meeting with people, partners, new partners, current partners, meeting with our staff in different parts. So we were I always say it's either Mumbai, Shanghai, or Dubai. I can't remember exactly, but we were in the back of that car, and she goes to me, she goes, I know that we knew it was going to work, but did we know it was going to work this good? And so I went on my, I had my iPad, and I have my own archival system of shit. I pulled the board materials from like 5-6 years prior, where we had gone to the board, said, hey, this is what we're going to do. And it was 100 pages listing out exactly how we were viewing the world and the blueprint of what we were going to build. Step by step, the direct-to-consumer surface, the social and digital, how we were going to take and start building a better academy to train our superstars, what we were going to do recruiting internet, all of it laid out in great detail. And I pulled it and showed it to her, and she tears up a little bit, right? I go, did we know? We fucking know. We wrote it down. We wrote it down. And so I teared up then, because I'm a big crier. And she starts choking up, and I got choking up. But it's one of my kind of like indelible memories of the journey. And the fact that her and I were, got to share it emotionally. Neither one of us. I say I'm a big crier, but if something's got to trigger it. Otherwise, people, I'm just going a million miles, and it just so happened. And I always relish that we got to share that kind of emotional moment as opposed to just high-fiving each other.
George, do you have a few more minutes to stick around, or do you have a hard stop?
No, I have a few more minutes.
Okay, I got a couple more questions. I just want to be respectful of your time. So speaking of Michelle, because I wanted to get to that, the tag team partnership there. I'm going to use, again, wrestling parlance for that. So it comes to really clearly, not just in the book, but obviously through this conversation, definitely in the book, that it's like the spine of the second half of the book. That's the way I kind of looked at it. You complement each other in specific ways. You talked about how you're more extra, like you're the extrovert, I mean, I don't know, Michelle and you have a lot of things in common, but there's got to be like, what has the partnership given you that you couldn't have gotten working alone? Because I think a lot of people underestimate how much the right collaborator changes what's possible. I mean, to bring it back a little bit to wrestling, like look at like people who have succeeded as tag teams, but not as singles wrestlers. Like, so in the case of, let's say currently, although it's really hard to use these guys as an example, but let's say the Street Profits as a WWE tag team right now, because they've only really been together. But there are examples of tag team wrestlers who went to do single stuff. There we go. The New Age Outlaws would be a great example of that, right? Like separately, they didn't do as well, but together, gold. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, you luck into it. So people always are fascinated that, we've now been business partner for 18 years. We've been co-heads of things. And people ask me like, oh, well, are you a big fan of that co-mod? I'm like, fuck no. I'm like, hey, first of all, I have too much of an ego. I don't want to be anything with anybody. But with her, and again, I'm different now than I was 20 years ago, right? You mature. But I was like, yeah, no, I wouldn't really recommend it. What happened is it was a combination of a couple of things. And it's less, people think, they see her background, my background, they go, you got complementary. I'm like, yeah, it's really not that. It's that we see the world so similarly that makes it easy, right? We both think of the outside first, work backwards from a North Star, and then work backwards, and then figure out what the plan is, the contingency when something's not working. My favorite Mike Tyson saying is everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face.
Yeah.
Been in a lot of fights, so I know exactly what he means. But in business, it's the same thing, right? You got a new product, a new customer, whatever. Man, you go out, you're going to get punched in the face. So you got a plan. Plan's nothing, planning's everything. But that relationship that I had someone, it's steel sharpens steel, that I had someone who would push back on me hard and that I respected, right? Because it wasn't bullshit. She had thought through this. It wasn't just talking and opining. She had her own process of clarifying her thinking. And yeah, look, and then we did it. We suffered together. I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah.
We came out of it, and it would have been very easy during the suffering to turn on each other, right? to say, hey,
sorry, as soon as you say that, but I mean, I think in wrestling terms,
the boat's going down,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
It could have very easily said, hey, that was his idea. Or I could have said, hey, that was her idea. It wasn't me. It was this collective of like, no, we believe, we've done the work, we know, we stayed through it. And then, you fight through it. And look, if we wouldn't have won, maybe different story. But the winning then says, yeah, and you were there when nobody else was. So it's a, like I said, it's a steel sharpened steel relationship. It got forged in a tough cauldron in that swamp, which makes it, I think, all the stronger. But yeah, it's I had the three great women in my life: my mom, my wife, and Michelle as a business partner. I've been very lucky.
As we get close to wrapping up here, there are 12 lessons that you summarize throughout the book, but at the end, you're kind of like, you go into during the book, and then you summarize them at the end. Of the 12 lessons, if somebody is looking to, like you said, you talked about the journaling habit, like you didn't start when you were in your 20s. You started when you were in your 40s, right? Like if someone's going to start today, what lesson do you think would be the simplest for them to, for lack of a better term, grok, so that way they can kind of move forward and again, start to live by their own mantra, whether it's sometimes wrong, but never in doubt, or something else?
Yeah, look, it's training your mind to be open to being wrong. And so this notion of when you're stuck on something, flip it completely 180, right? I remember my example in the book is Michelle and I were in a room. We were talking about our video content being pirated in China. So we were in this thing telling our lawyers, pull this shit down, stop the pirates, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden, both of us got quiet, because we were both thinking the same thing, where we were like, hold on a second. And I remember then verbalizing, I'm like, well, hold on a second. What we're doing over here is we're pushing this strategy of winning the attention for time. If right now the pirates, because the pirates were better than us at taking our content, subtitling it, and getting it out. They were doing it faster, which is why they were winning. I'm like, fuck it. Don't pull it down. I still remember the lawyer looking at me like I was crazy. We had just told him, get this shit down now. He's like on the phone, blah, blah, blah. 5 minutes later, we go, get back on. Tell him not to take it down. But this whole thing of stopping sometimes when you're stuck and saying, maybe I'm thinking about it, and going on the opposite. What you think is right, assume that's wrong. What would you do then? It's an eye-opening process, and I use it all the time. The technical term you hear people talk about a lot is inversion, right? So that it's a huge one. And then the second thing, which is harder, it's not easy, but it is the core unlock, is never accept what people tell you is the way things are unless they can prove it to you at the most fundamental level, right? My example in the book we talk about is wrestling was worth what wrestling was worth because that's what it had always been worth. That was the logic. It's circular, right? So basically the person saying that, and that was everybody, hadn't really thought about what drove value, right? Our unlock was that what's valuable is time, time spent consuming live content. Who the fuck cares that it's wrestling? People are consuming this around the world, right? Because we've built that. And so that's the unlock. Seems simple. Literally everyone on the planet said we were wrong about that. But that forcing, again, people, what's the cool term? First principles thinking. But it really comes down to when somebody says something is, don't believe it. Don't accept it unless they can really prove it to you, right? And telling me that it is because it isn't, you've proved nothing, right? It's tautological. You've actually proven nothing by saying that. So those to me are like huge lessons.
George, the book, sometimes wrong, but never in doubt, how a Cuban kid from Queens transformed WWE. Where can people pick up the book? And where can they keep up with what you've got going on? I mean, yeah. And also, who's your favorite wrestler? No, I'm just kidding. Just those two. Where can people pick up the book?
Ricky, well, I'll date myself. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat.
WrestleMania 3, the match between Savage and then his feud with Flair. Yeah.
And he was working at WWE. I don't know if he's still there when I first joined. He was one of the guys who would help develop the next generation.
Yeah, he was a producer. He was a producer, right? I think at that time.
You know the terminology exactly.
Yeah,
he was a producer. But anyway, meeting Ricky was a big thrill. But yeah, in terms of where you can get the book, it's up for pre-order on Amazon. Release date is Tuesday, June 2nd. Super excited. We're going to have a preview up of. We're going to make the prologue available on georgebarrios.com, so you get a sense of the book, and hopefully you like what you read it, and you pick up a copy.
George, thanks for having a productive conversation with me today.
It was awesome, Mike. Thank you. I really loved it. I love what you do. I love the what you're tackling, this notion of time and how important that is in whatever domain you do, whether it's personal, professional, whatever. But, so it's been a thrill. It's a fun conversation. Plus, I love talking to passionate wrestling fans.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining for the live stream. George, can you stick around for like a minute after I end the live stream just so we can do a quick after thing, like 5 minutes? Is that okay? All right, cool. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching the live stream. This episode will be presented as a bonus episode in time for the book launch and all that stuff. So appreciate you being here. Thanks again, and we will see you next time. See you later.